My name is Patrick Zampetti. I was baptized Pasquale Zampetti in a town called Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1932. I went to school in Elizabeth, New Jersey at the Thomas Jefferson all-boys high school. Shortly after I graduated from high school, probably a year and a half later, I received a notice from a local draft board telling me my friends and neighbors had asked me to become a member of the United States Armed Forces. I went for my physical, passed 1A, and in August of 1952, I reported for duty in Newark, New Jersey, and from there, they bused us to Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, where I did my basic training. Basic training was rough because I hadn't been used to all that, but they did tell us that the hills were similar to those in Korea, and we could all expect to be in Korea after we finished. Well, I found out there was an opportunity to go to school in Fort Benning, Georgia, and I volunteered for the school. I was accepted, and after a short leave for Christmas, I reported to Fort Benning, Georgia in January of '53. When I got there, I found out it was called Infantry sound ranging, where we had teams that would be put out on the outpost, trapping artillery sound, the enemy artillery sounds, and after triangulation, we were able to pinpoint where the enemy shell was fired from. When we arrived at the school in Fort Benning, Georgia, and by the way, it was my first trip to Georgia and first trip out of state except for Pennsylvania to visit my grandparents. But when we got to Georgia, we were ushered into a huge auditorium. It must have been about 40 of us. And we had volunteered for this school. And the colonel got up and said he wanted to thank all of us, that in his mind we were all heroes because we had actually volunteered to go to Korea. I can't say I was happy about that, but I wasn't unhappy. Having been raised patriotically, I felt that it was my duty to do what my country asked me to do. We had school for 6 weeks. We were out on a course they had set up where we had artillery going off in the distance, and the two teams would be separated, and we would trap the sound of the artillery and then plot it. The captain of the group, the leader of the group, would then plot it on a map, and we would be able to pinpoint where our artillery should fire their rounds to get rid of that artillery that was firing at us. At the end of 6 weeks, we had a little graduation ceremony. We were told that we were going to Korea, and we didn't get a leave after that. And they had a plane pick us up, and the whole bunch of us flew out to California, and we ended up in Camp Stoneham in California. And from there, we were assigned to Korea and board the U.S. General Black. We were on the General Black for 19 days, and one thing I discovered, I shouldn't make rash decisions because I decided the lower bunk would be great because I wouldn't have to climb up, and it would be easy for me to get up in the morning, but I soon discovered that when there's a bunch of seasick guys above you, you do not want to be in the bottom bunk. So 19 days, a lot of them wet. After that, we sailed into Tokyo Bay, and it was a sight to see Mount Fuji on the horizon when we got there. We went to a camp there overnight where we were given our combat gear and weapons, and the next morning we were back on the ship and sailed south around the coast of Japan, southern Korea, and were docked, rather not docked, but we were anchored off the port of Inchon. Now, we had a long wait while we were in Inchon, and I never found out why we had that wait until I read about Korea after I got home, because the tides were so so great that we had to wait or else we would not make it to shore. Anyway, we came in on landing craft, made a landing. 3,000 of us were standing around in that area, and a colonel got up on the stage and announced to us that he welcomed us to Korea, and announced that the Chinese had been acting up on the line. They had broken through at some points, and regardless of what we went to school for, we were now all in the infantry. Looking back, trying to remember what date it was. I don't know the date I landed in Inchon, but I know it was somewhere around the end of March. I was told that I was going to be in the 17th Infantry Regiment of the 7th Division, and which meant nothing to me because I was green to all of that. They loaded us onto trucks. I guess they were 2.5-ton trucks, and they had canvas covering over them, look a little bit like stagecoaches or something, or covered wagons. And I had a seat right at the end of looking out the back. And the ride was very dusty, very bumpy, and I was covered with dust. But I still think I was better off than being one of the guys that were inside, deep in the belly of that monster. We rode over bumpy roads. It was still daylight, and it was starting to get dusk when we heard the sounds of artillery. Actually, we could hear artillery when we were in Inchon, but as we got closer, it was louder and louder. And when we got to where we had to get off, I was told I got off, and we had a little assembly of the groups, and they put me in a group, and they called it the P&A platoon group of the 2nd Battalion, 17th Infantry Regiment. We were shown to our quarters, which was a squad tent, I guess you call it, and immediately after getting there, we were fed, and they put us back on a truck, and we headed out to a ammunition dump or depot to load up the trucks with ammo. And that night we made our first visit out to Pork Chop Hill. When we got to the ammunition depot, I can't say I wasn't scared, because I was. In fact, I was scared the moment I heard the artillery when we were down in Inchon. But so were a lot of other guys, so I really didn't feel I was out of place. When we got to the ammo dump, we loaded the trucks. We had 2 trucks, as I remember. Loaded them with a lot of M1 rifle ammunition, 30 caliber, I believe, and some mortar shells. And I can't remember what else, but I know there was a lot of ammo. We had 2 truckfuls. From there, we got back on the trucks, and we were already tired. And I thought I was going to collapse then, but I didn't realize what I had ahead of me yet. So I was feeling very apprehensive about the whole thing. And I actually said to myself, what are you doing here? What did you do wrong to find yourself in this position? And really, I didn't do anything wrong. I was doing what I thought I had to do. Go ahead. When I got to my unit and the P&A platoon, I had no idea what what it stood for. They told us that, well, talking to the guys that were in the tent with me, they told me a lot. They said it stood for Pioneer and Ammunition, and our job was to keep the troops on the line supplied with ammo. The more they used it, the more we had to go out and bring it out to them. The Pioneer part was putting up barbed wire, putting in landmines, trip flares, anything that required something other than what an infantry soldier would do. Um, so not knowing what any of those things really entailed, I wasn't too upset. But it turned out to be a little more than what I thought. One morning we were all called out into the area, and I think it was a colonel got up in front of us and said that we were going to be barbed wire installers. And they proceeded to spend about an hour with us, teaching us how to put stakes in the ground, how to twist the wire around the stakes, and to set the stakes at the right distance apart. Having never done that before, it was something new to all of us. That night, we all piled into trucks again with barbed wire, with stakes, went out to the checkpoint and did our transfer again. We transferred everything into APCs and then rode out to the hill. It was a bumpy ride. It was sort of quiet. But there were flares going off continuously while we were going out. I didn't find out till later on that we actually were in sight of the Chinese where they held Old Baldy, and could see everything on that road. We got to what they called the Chow bunker, unloaded everything, and brought it up to the top of the hill. We put it up in the trenches, laid it down, and then went into one of the bunkers. And the guys in there said, "What are you guys doing up here?" And I remember distinctly one of them saying, after we told them that we were going to put barbed wire up out in front of the concertina wire, that's what our orders were. My job was just to put stakes in and tie the barbed wire. I wasn't a radio man or anything like that. And they said, "You mean you're going to go out in front of the concertina wire?" And we told them, "Yeah, that's what we were told." They said, "Wow, did you guys volunteer for this?" And we all had a big laugh over that. Because that's the last thing that we did, was volunteer. But anyway, we climbed over the top of the trench, handed each other the barbed wire and stakes, and made our way down through the concertina wire, down to the spot in front of where the concertina wire was. The concertina wire was pretty well beaten up. When we got down to where we were supposed to be, we located the stake that ended where the platoon that had been out there before us had ended before we took over. It was a scary thing, let me tell you. Not as scary as I guess the rifle guys went through, but to us first-timers it was scary. We had mortar shells going off when every time we heard that, we froze. Basic training paid off, because that's one of the things they taught us in basic training. When you hear the pop of a mortar shell going off, or if a flare goes off, just freeze in place. Don't try to get down or hide or anything, because that just pinpoints where you are. So that's what we did. We spent a lot of time just stopping and posing for the mortar shells and flares that went off, flickering light. And the first night we were out there, we did hear music. We had been told that the Chinese played music, and we heard music. And it was hard to know who was singing, but it was a woman singing a love song. And it was a popular tune, so we could recognize the tune. But anyway, that kept us entertained a little bit and really didn't scare us. On one of our trips out there, and there were 7 nights that we were out before we were relieved, but on one of the nights, we heard mortars going off, the popping, and way down, well, we were halfway down the hill. We had the concertina wire between us and the top of the hill where our guys were. So we were down in, I guess, as far in no man's land and still being on the hill. But we heard the shells, we heard the pops, and we froze, but we also started hearing yelling from the top of the hill. And we heard them, the guys were all yelling, "Get out of there, get out, get out." And we realized they were calling us, and that the shells were coming up, actually up the hill. And they knew we were there, and they were trying to get us. So we all dropped everything we had, and we started running uphill. Now, I remember running and not seeing anybody. We had just scattered, and I discovered I was all alone. So I came to a trench after I got through the concertina wire. I came to a trench, and I jumped into it and started running. Now, I learned something that night, that if you can't see above the top of a trench and you start running and you're exhausted, you don't know if you're running uphill or downhill. And how did I know that? Because when I got to a certain point, I heard yelling, saying, "Halt!" And when I got there were two GIs. And they told me I was down at a listening post, and I had been running downhill the whole time. And I was lucky, I guess, that they didn't just shoot me rather than yell, "Halt." But anyway, they pointed me out up the right direction, put me in the right trench, and I went uphill, and we joined forces with the other guys up there in their P&A platoon, and they assigned us to a trench on what I assume was the south side of the hill. They told us it was above the chow bunker, and we were told to just get down because they had called for a flash pork chop. That's what they called it. And we found out it meant that they used various variable time fuses to set off the ammo above the grade. Well, when we got to where we were assigned, we were told to lay down in the trench with our backs against the back wall and point our carbines out at the top of the edge, of the front edge, so that in case anybody came over, we could shoot them. Because we understood there was like a small force of Chinese that were just probing at that time. And flash pork chop was going to go off instantly. And flash pork chop was a new name. We never knew what it meant until it happened. And we heard the most tremendous crashes and booms that we ever heard in our lives. Now, from our position on the back of the hill, we could hear a lot of yelling and screaming and guns going off. We heard machine gun fire, and the VT was and the VT display was probably the best fireworks I ever saw in my life and ever would see. The flashes and booms, and there was shrapnel flying all over the place. And I recall one going by my ear, and I had to touch my ear to make sure it was there, but it didn't hit me. And the screaming and yelling, and at the time, I recall they turned searchlights on, and the sky was lit up, and the ground in front of us was lit up, but nobody came up that side of the hill. But we did find out later that there was a probe on the north side, and that's what all the screaming and yelling was. As I say, that's probably the best display of fireworks I ever saw, and the worst display, and what resulted from it. That wasn't the last night we were there. We were out 7 nights and filling our time on the hill. One of the nights we went out, we were down. One of the nights we went out, prior to going out, we were told that the fog was in our favor and we should stay working until the fog started to lift. And that way we'd get in more hours of work, because they did want to complete that fence. So when we got to the checkpoint, they had smoke pots, or smudge pots, whatever you want to call them. that we put in the APCs and took with us. When we got to the top and climbed out over the trench and down through the concertina to where we had left off the night before, we started working. And I remember that night for another reason too, because I was, I guess, the guy who put the stakes in. And I would set the stakes, and we had another team that tied the wire. Anyway, I got to a point where I was putting a stake, and a flare had gone off, and I froze. And when the flare went off, I noticed right there where I was going to put the stake was a dead Chinese boy. And he was a boy, he wasn't a man. And he had a book sticking out of his pocket, which I was dying to take, but I had heard about booby-trapped things like that, and picking up one would be your end. So I left that alone, and finally decided to put the stake in a spot between his armpit where it seemed I could get the stake through, and that's what I did. And I'll never forget that. I used to dream about that. And I thought about this poor boy, and maybe that thing was a diary. And he probably had a girlfriend or a wife just like me back home. Anyway, when we finally, toward dawn, there was still a couple hours of dawn left, we set the smoke pots off, and it got thicker. You know, there was more fog than normal. And we just kept working away, not worrying about anybody seeing us, until again, this night, like previous night, we heard the guys up top yelling to us. And when we looked up, we walked up a little bit and looked up, realized there was no fog anywhere else except where we were. We were sitting right there, and the Chinese knew something was going on. And then suddenly we heard mortar shells starting to land down below. And we got out of there fast, just like we had done one of the previous nights. And that was the last time we went out in smoke pots. And we thought the colonel really had a bad idea. Go ahead. On the trip back home after that night where we were sitting in the trench with our carbines pointed out, and the VT fire was going off, when that was over with, we made our way and down to the bottom of the hill, back to the chow bunker to wait our ride back to the checkpoint. And that was my first sight of dead American boys. There probably were 6 or 7 of them laying in a row, not in the bunker, but outside the bunker. And they wanted to get them off the hill. Well, they put 2 of the boys, strapped them on a tank, and they just called out and wanted somebody to volunteer to hold these guys on to make sure they didn't fall off. And I never gave it a thought. I just volunteered. And I sat on top of that tank holding these guys who were turning purple. And I realized they were dead. And that was my first time, other than in a funeral home, seeing a dead body and boys that died fighting for their country. And I never got over that. And the ride back, and I never thought I did anything great either, and it wasn't. It was just something I wanted to do. When I heard the singing love song coming over the loudspeakers, it made me, well, let me put it this way. If they were trying to make us homesick, it worked, because I became very homesick. And I think I might have even teared up thinking about home. But that's the way it was. I had a girlfriend back home. We were engaged to be married. We had been going together since she was 13 and I was 15. And we had gotten engaged just before I shipped out for Korea. And I kept thinking about her. Well, I don't have to think about her anymore, because we've been married now 53 years. And but I often think of those days. Funny thing, we have never talked about anything like I'm talking about now, and she'll be hearing things for the first time when she hears this. When we got back from our first flash pork chop experience, we were still all revved up and not ready to go to sleep. So we decided we'd go out to a little range they had set up behind the line and fire our weapons, our carbines. Well, we got the surprise of our life because when we went to shoot them, we found out they were clogged and jammed. And if anyone had come over the top of that trench when we were in there, we probably would have been dead because we wouldn't have been able to shoot them. Now, I didn't know too much about battles, what was going on. I only knew what I was doing. And it wasn't until I got back home and I read a book called On Hollow Ground that I realized that what was going on all around, in addition to what we were doing, and by comparison, what we were doing was nothing. And I felt a little ashamed about that. And but I guess we all had our jobs to do, and putting them all together made us a good group. Now, I also realized I wasn't there for the July battle for pork chop. And let me tell you about that, because when we finished our barbed wire job, one morning I was called by the sergeant of our group, and he called me and asked me to come into the company command office. When I got there, they told me to pack my stuff up because I was going to a school in Japan, that the truce talks were going along real well, and that when the truce talks came, we were going to move out of where we were, and we were going to move to do fortifications back some miles south of where the old ones were, and we needed guys to be trained in the making of new fortifications, and they wanted somebody who had some leadership ability. And I found out later when I came back, but the sergeant that was in charge had recommended me for the job because, let me tell you the truth, I was so scared when I was out there on the side of that hill. I used to work 50 miles an hour because I figured the faster I worked, the faster we were going to get out of there. And I think that probably might have saved my life but I feel guilty about that. Why me? Why was I chosen? But I did go to a school in Japan at the old Japanese, it wasn't old, but the Japanese Naval Academy, which we had taken over after the war and converted to a school for military people. And I attended a 6-week school there on combat engineering, learning how to build bridges, how to blow up fortifications, how to construct new fortifications. I learned about everything there could be to know about that type of thing. And I reported back to my unit in August of '53, probably middle of August if I look back, and the war was over. They had already been moved back, and I proceeded to spend the rest of my time in Korea leading a group of guys. I was promoted to sergeant upon my return, and I led a squad in building new fortifications. We had Koreans working with us, and it was pretty much a cream puff job because I would tell them dig a hole there, they'd dig the hole, I'd plant the explosives, and boom, we'd blow it up, and then they would dig that hole out. But anyway, it was more than that, but that's the part I remember.
Just one couple seconds left. Tell us when you got home.
I got home, and we got to Busan. On my way home, back to Busan, lo and behold, what was the name of the ship I was getting on? The U.S. General Black. And we got on that ship, and we were headed out. We were on the ship 5 hours when we heard, it was about 2 in the morning, and we heard a boom, and the ship came to a dead stop. And the alarm went off to all hands on deck. We were told to don't bother dressing, just bring your life jacket. Seemed we had been rammed by a Chinese nationalist boat in the fog, and it had ripped a hole in the side of the boat. Luckily, the guys who were quartered in that section of the boat were on KP that night and were not in there because all their luggage and everything was swept right out to sea. We ended up in Sasebo for 2 weeks while the ship was being repaired, but from there on, we were on our way back home.
My contact with the enemy was just before we. My contact with the enemy was just before I rotated, and that is indelible in my mind. Going up this hill and being mortared and artillery and seeing bodies just torsos just laying there, bodies blown apart, arms and legs gone, heads gone. And I still have indelible memory of these incidents. I rotated, and that is indelible in my mind. Going up this hill and being mortared and artillery and seeing bodies just torsos just laying there, bodies blown apart, arms and legs gone, heads gone. And I still have indelible memory of these incidents.